Welcome to Be the Bridge 101, Session 5, Recognizing White Supremacy. I was folding clothes the other day and turned on the TV to discover that they were playing one of my all-time favorite Westerns, The Magnificent Seven. Yul Brynner, Steve McQueen, Charles Bronson, Robert Vaughn, James Coburn, and others. It's a story of a small Mexican village plagued by bandits who crossed the border into the United States in search of help. It's a classic story of vulnerable, victimized, almost powerless folks saved from the evil, predatory, and violent bad guys. I'm a sucker for stories like this where the tables get turned and the noble weak somehow vanquish the predatory strong. But this time watching the movie, I had a different reaction. I noticed something I'd never noticed watching this movie before, thanks in part, I think, to Be the Bridge 101. What I saw was this entire village of frightened, inept Mexicans, unable to defend themselves, who are literally saved and taught the basics of self-defense by a small group of white American gunfighters. Now, it led me to wonder how many other ways I'd been celebrating this white male to the rescue in films, stories, and shows, and the depiction of other nationalities or cultures as inept, backwards, and dependent on people like me to save the day. There's something deeply rooted in me that likes to raise that foam "we're number one" finger, stirring feelings of pride. Like when the Vikings win the Super Bowl. Well, maybe a bad example. Or when the Gophers win the Rose Bowl. Well, maybe not much better. Well, when the Twins won the World Series 30 years ago, we were number one. We swell with pride when we think of that, or when we read that Minnesota is consistently top 5 in college entrance scores, literacy, reading of newspapers, use of libraries, quality of social services, generosity, and numbers of old Lutheran pastors. When I was a graveyard shift cook at Perkins, paying my way through seminary, the number one menu item far and away was called the Perkins Supreme. Just a burger with cheese, bacon, and barbecue sauce. And there were other pedestrian burgers like the Whopper and the Big Mac, but there was only one Supreme. We like supremacy. We hate fragility. We cherish moments of number oneness. We hunger for the view from the catbird seat and anything that pats us on the back and tells us how great we are, or reinforces our belief that we're a cut above. There's no surprise there. It's not in and of itself a bad thing. But the problem is when we get there while trampling down the value of others, when we need to cut others off at the knees to make ourselves appear taller, when we find ourselves doing despicable things in order to hang on to or feed our desire for the idolatry of supremacy, superiority. Now, it may surprise you that as I talk about white supremacy, I'm not going to refer to the Ku Klux Klan or any of the many other white supremacist groups that are easy targets. To do so would just give us a false sense of superiority that we're not like them. We don't hate, we don't target, we don't murder, we don't threaten, we don't behave like immoral idiots. We don't go waving our number one foam fingers in the faces of people of color. We think we're so much better than that. Let's agree that tonight it will not be helpful to focus our attention on the more toxic, perverted, insecure, and pathetic examples of white supremacy. But instead, what you and I need to do, what we need to come to grips with, listen to, and learn from, grow knowledgeable about, and lament is the extent to which white supremacy has permeated American culture and identity and has permeated us. It needs to be acknowledged, confessed, lamented, finally changed. In an article I read by ethicist Dr. Reggie Williams entitled "White Supremacy is a Script We're Given at Birth," he makes a statement that white supremacy, that, as most of us know, it's not a matter of liking or not liking other races. It's not about hatred or a desire to harm another community. White supremacy comes out of a longing for an ideal community populated with only ideal people like us. How we understand and measure what it means to be human is framed in the perspective of whiteness. Political, economic, social, and religious systems have been and are created to work in harmony with each other, to manufacture and maintain that idealized community we want to live in. The image of America as the great melting pot of all these diverse peoples is predicated on the desire that all of those cultures, nationalities, and distinctiveness become absorbed and assimilated into a dominant white culture. That's what we believe the melting pot to be. This past summer, I read a book titled American Nations, a history of the 11 rival regional cultures of North America. The author is Colin Woodard, and he maintains that political strategists have long known, even going back to the 1960s, that there are not 50 unique states, but 11 regional cultures that can trace their ethics and values back to the early days of the American experiment and the reach of colonial powers. One of the themes throughout is how the different regions addressed and responded to issues like immigration, slavery, and those who were non-white. It revealed a history of the United States far different than the one I was taught in public school. Understanding how that history has unfolded in those 11 regions is critical for understanding how the belief of supremacy of whites emerged, how it grew, and how it established itself in different ways throughout the country. Our history, elements of our culture, are the result of a competition among European empire builders and colonizers. It was in 1452, 40 years before Columbus took a wrong turn and didn't ask for directions and ended up in the Caribbean and the east coast of North America. 40 years before that, Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull, a decree declaring that God had granted permission to the nations of Europe to capture, to vanquish, to subdue the enemies of Christ, to enslave native peoples and confiscate their possessions for the motherland. What happened was that the history of much of the world in the succeeding centuries is the story of how European powers came to assert their supremacy and their strength by colonizing the rest of the world. The Spanish, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the French, and the British all embarked on efforts to claim non-Christian lands, non-white lands, for crown and country. Inhabitants, viewed as savages, non-human, forced to adopt the values, faith, and allegiances of their conquerors. They even drew artificial borders in North, Central, and South America, across Africa and the Middle East, irrespective of existing affinities and hostilities between tribes and peoples. And what those artificial borders represented was only the sphere of influence exerted by the occupying power. They changed the history of the world. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI granted Spain ownership of almost the entire Western Hemisphere on one condition. They were to convert all the native inhabitants to Catholicism, to train them in good morals. When the first British arrived over 100 years later at Jamestown, the Spanish had already visited and claimed the Grand Canyon, mapped the coast of Oregon all the way down to the tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego. When the English arrived, contrary to the narrative that we heard of them seeking religious freedom and escaping persecution, the primary motive of English settlement was seeking land and wealth, establishing a new aristocracy here just as there was back home, lords and ladies and manors. The British Virginia Company expected these new settlers to conquer the natives just as the Spanish had conquered their natives and put them to work mining gold and silver, working as agricultural laborers. When the British introduced tobacco and then cotton, they found that these were very labor intensive, and for a while the work was handled by indigenous peoples as well as the poor and indentured servants imported from England. But when that labor pool was decimated by death and disease, they began importing black slaves from the Caribbean and African nations. Stripped of their culture, stripped of their identities and heritage, many were baptized and then given European names. And despite the variety of their cultures, the richness of their ancestries, they were all lumped together as one, called negri or negros, the Spanish-Portuguese word for black. In 1790, Congress passed the Naturalization Act, stating that only a free white person could become a U.S. citizen. And in the 1790 census, the first census of the United States, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson arranged for the counting of only free white men, 16 and older, free white boys under 16, free white women, all other free people. They counted slaves as 3/5 of a person and did not count Native Americans at all. They weren't people. In 1823, the Supreme Court declared that indigenous people could not own land, and therefore settlers were free to just take it. In 1831, Native tribes were declared dependent nations, wards of the U.S. government, incapable, incompetent of self-rule. Now, I bring these up because in these and many other ways, white supremacy was enshrined in the laws of the land and enforced by even the highest of courts. When 4 million slaves were emancipated following the Civil War, an economic crisis was created by the loss of all this cheap labor. Laws were then created and enforced to replace slavery with sharecropping, free prison labor, Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation. And again, the Supreme Court affirmed this, affirming separate but equal in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, ultimately allowing Jim Crow laws to persist until 1965. Now, these are just a few examples. There's so much more history that sheds light on how we have come to this place, where we are today. Why it is important to understand how the view of white supremacy has become so deeply rooted in our past, our national narratives, the protection of economic interests, and how we, as white people, have come to view people of different races and cultures. Some examples include compromises and collusion following the Civil War that I just raised up, made in an effort to try to heal the divided republic, but which essentially allowed the subject status of Black people to be perpetuated in the South. In the 1880s, following an influx of Chinese workers who came here to build railroads, there was the Chinese Exclusionary Act banning Chinese immigration for decades. At the same time, Europeans such as the Italians, the Irish, and the Germans were also perceived as a threat. But because of their whiteness, they were able more easily to become assimilated and accepted into American culture. At the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, estimates of between 400,000 and 2 million Mexicans were expelled by local authorities, even though many of them were U.S. citizens. Some of them had had ancestors who lived in the Western United States for hundreds of years. It was until 1930 Mexican Americans were counted as white people. But that was changed in 1930 as racism resulted in the creation of a new category of non-whites, simply called Mexican. Then in 1934, in response to the Great Depression, as part of Roosevelt's New Deal, the Federal Housing Authority created federally backed FHA mortgages to spur home ownership, to rebuild the economy. But in the language, it required appraisers to give higher preference to white-only neighborhoods, to avoid financing mortgages in areas that were decided to be less stable and high risk, defined in the documents as any neighborhood housing a mixture of races, or any neighborhood near to a predominantly Black neighborhood. What it resulted in was the destruction of our inner cities. After World War II, Black veterans received only 2% of all the mortgage funding offered through the GI Bill, and most were denied the educational benefits as well, again contributing to a growing gap in household wealth and opportunities that still has ramifications today. The result of all these and other historical developments was that being white became and persisted as the norm. Non-whites, consistently viewed as other, may be dangerous, inferior, less capable, less worthy, and sometimes even labeled less than human. Those who could be assimilated into whiteness were given opportunities that those who resisted were often victims of violence or force. One of the more horrific examples, I think, was when Native American children were taken away from their families, placed in church-run schools where their culture and their faith practices were forbidden and punished. They were given new Christian names, forced to become Christian. And many suffered abuse, degradation, and even death at the hands of religious leaders and clergy. As you read in your materials for tonight, the painful truth is that we, the church in the United States, have often been on the wrong side of history. We've taken Bible verses out of context to support slavery, to justify Christians being slave owners, to support the Mexican expulsions, segregation, separate but equal policies. We've quoted scripture to support white male and heterosexual dominance and the treatment of non-whites, women, and gays as inferior. We've quoted the Bible to reinforce and legitimize those prejudices, to legitimize white supremacy, male supremacy, Christian supremacy, heterosexual supremacy. All of those things still have taproots into the American soul and systems. And the defensiveness and anger that emerges when they're challenged are no less real today than before. I'm curious how you respond. If you responded as I did when you read the following section in tonight's session's materials on page 19, where Latasha Morrison says, in our pride, we like to imagine that if we would have been on the right side of these moral texts if we'd lived during those periods in history. But humility, not to mention our refusal to learn from our mistakes, demands the uncomfortable truth. Here you go. If we despise the Black Lives Matter movement now, very likely we would have despised Dr. Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement then. If we support the idea of separating undocumented immigrant parents and children at the border now, we probably would have supported the idea of Japanese internment camps then. If we are in favor of strict voter ID laws now, we likely would have been in favor of literacy tests and poll taxes then. It's somewhat easier to paint ourselves on the right side of history in retrospect. But time and again, we've proved that the white American church continues to get it wrong. In the Bible, there's no conception of race. People are differentiated by the gods they worship, the trades they practiced, the locations they inhabited, their cultures, rituals, the leaders they follow. In the Old Testament, there's Israel and there are the nations. In the New Testament, there were Jews and there were Gentiles. There's no conception of race. But that didn't stop white theologians in America from claiming that in Genesis 9, when Noah punishes his son Ham's son Canaan, saying, "Cursed be Canaan and let him be the lowest of slaves among his brethren," that it gives proof to biblical support of the institution of slavery. That was preached in our pulpits. And that the curse upon Canaan is the origin of people having black skin. White theologians preached that. And Paul's words in the New Testament, where slaves should be obedient to their masters, was quoted as also giving divine blessing to the institution of slavery and the owning of slaves. In this early history of America, numerous white preachers and theologians, not just Mormons, began to refer to this nation as the Promised Land and saw European settlers as God's new chosen people, the new Israel being represented by white Americans. And just as in the Old Testament, Israel had forcibly removed and eradicated peoples from the land they believed God had given them, it offered pioneers divine approval to eradicate indigenous people from the land, just as the Israelites had once cleansed the Canaanites. That's our history. Peter Marty, the editor of the Christian Century and an ELCA pastor, shares what he calls a secret he learned from Eugene Peterson. Eugene Peterson's that brilliant Bible scholar who wrote the Bible paraphrase called The Message. Eugene Peterson says, to know the Bible is less about me reading it and more about having it read me. And in having the Bible read me, I essentially consent to having it splay my heart wide open, exposing uncomfortable truths about my life, like self-righteousness, self-importance, and a bunch of other self-words. He says, loving Scripture becomes loving the one who speaks the words enough to want to get them right. And Peter Marty says, that's a project most of us spend our entire lives working on. One of our goals in Be the Bridge 101 is to get to work, to let the Bible read us, to let the Bible unmask those places where we have become blind to the impact of systems and biases that we've inherited and in some ways never let go. To recognize that as much as we dislike the term fragility, we also have a little bit of an unacknowledged love affair with the idea of supremacy. Now, Jesus said numerous times that greatness is found in the one willing to stand alongside the weak. That number one in God's kingdom willingly lifts others up ahead of them. And in the Sermon on the Mount, that blessedness is deepest in those actions and choices that stand against the world's self-aggrandizing values. Paul in Philippians 2 shares an early creed that states that Jesus never counted equality with God something to be grasped with an iron grip, but instead made himself vulnerable by letting go of his supremacy, humbling himself while looking to the interests of others before his own. White supremacy exists in systems and in structures, in our writings and in our reading of history, not because we're bad people, not because we hate or don't like people of color, because we have not raised the question or taken the time to listen, learn, confess, lament, and change. I read the other day somebody saying that the enemy of history is nostalgia, believing in a past that never was, ignoring the truth about what has been and is. So let's set nostalgia aside. Let's commit to letting the Bible read us, lead us, challenge us, correct us, empower us. Because if I'm honest about the first and next steps to doing this, and asking who most needs to hear what Scripture and history lays bare, in this case, it is truly safe to say, I am number one. Blessings on your conversations.